right, good morning. Let's all turn to the book of Ecclesiastes. We'll be looking at that on today, but also on Wednesday. Broken this up into two classes as well. The book of Ecclesiastes. Okay, so in the handouts in the beginning of the quarter, we'll be on pages 31 through 33 today. Several things that we want to talk about, kind of to introduce Ecclesiastes and kind of discuss how we're going to go through it. We'll wind up reading most of it as we go through it, but we first want to talk about kind of the general theme, and that is that we begin and we can see in verse 2, vanity of vanities, all is vanity. So really it's discussing the fact that here ultimately, our life is empty, right? That life is empty when you're here on this earth, and this takes a very worldly view of things as we look through Ecclesiastes. But we'll see that there's things that are good in this life, but there's also this issue that even though there are things that are good in this life, you can't actually find fulfillment, true fulfillment, or anything past that temporary satisfaction that you may get from it. So life is ultimately empty. But then we are led to a broader conclusion that we have to look what is beyond the sun, that statement that's made here, right? We have to look to God, we have to fear God, and that gives us a deeper understanding of things that we should do and to live our lives and actually have meaning for it. And so I know that our book and Bob Walter spent some time in his book about this as well. But talking about the authorship, I think, as far as I'm concerned, I'm a pretty simple-minded person, though. So as far as I'm concerned, it seems pretty obvious as to who the author is here. In verse 1, it talks about the words of the preacher, son of David, the king in Jerusalem. So there were a lot of, how many sons of David were king in Jerusalem? Well, there were more than one, right? If we look past the physical one single son, right? Solomon was the first one, but then his whole line was a king in Jerusalem. But then when we look at verse 12, it says, have been king over Israel in Jerusalem. Now all of a sudden, how many sons of David were king over all of Israel in Jerusalem? And that's one, because Solomon's son begins the divided kingdom. That begins our next. We see this split. And so it's simple for us to conclude that Solomon is the author. There's also a significant number of clues, I think, throughout the text that lead us back to proverbs that were written that are attributed to Solomon, things that Solomon had and his skill and his things that we know about his wisdom and his wealth that are also referred to here. So I certainly consider the author Solomon. There's an interesting discussion about why others disagree with that, and a lot of those thoughts came much later, around the time of Luther, I believe, is when all that started. And so there's some that disagree with that. Now, it's important that we understand that aspect of it, because we also see the concept of people's view of the book of Ecclesiastes, and that it may be somewhat cynical in its nature. If you don't understand who the true author is, you can lend credence to those kind of concepts. So there's a list of phrases, and I think it's important for us to walk through some of these phrases that we see, because they'll be repeated and we should just kind of have this understanding of what some of those phrases are. Now, here's the concept of under the sun. What does that really refer to? Don't we all live under the sun? That's really talking about what we have limited to here on this earth. And about 35 times we see the term either under the sun, under heaven, or on earth. And that is ignoring, things that are beyond this world, things of God. We also see the word vanity here a lot, and that is really talking about this emptiness, this lack of profit that we can find here under the sun. And then I even said the word here, but profits. So what is our life investment, or this measure of our worthwhileness, the measure of our life, and yet sometimes we see that this profit gives us nothing. And then labor, which is what we do to gain profit, these things that, more than just a consideration of our specific job, but the entire work that we've done our entire life, the labor of all that we have, is typically the way that the word labor is used here as we go through the book. Then we have the term evil, and I think there may be a time or two where it's really considered wickedness, like we always consider evil, but in many cases it's really talking about this undesirable end, or this unhappy event, or something that we think is incorrect, some situation that is not correct. So it's not really talking about the morality piece of evil. It's talking about this outcome that is not what we expected. And then we see a concept where Solomon says he either turned or he returned. In the lesson, it really talks about that being, we're walking through this whole concept of walking with Solomon as he's talking about these various things that he's observed and seen, and then at times he turns back and looks at that and gives us an observation. It's also a concept, an idea that he has observed these many things. He stops for a minute, considers what we could do for that, and then comes back to the observations, the bigger observations of it. So, turning and returning, and then there are multiple references to God that we see that really talks about the answer to all these problems that we introduced there for the theme. Right? There's these issues that happen, and then the answer is really looking toward God, and the whole concept of we have vanity, we have this evil, or this concept of not understanding why this occurred, and that we should turn to God because He can actually help us understand that and create something that is far greater than what we have on this earth. So, quickly, there's several ways to outline this book. We're sticking with one that basically has 4 different discourses. It's the way Bob Waldron outlined it in his book as well. But some will chop it up in half. Others will use other break points. But I think the main reason that we do this is in the end of the book is usually what a lot of people know. They remember Ecclesiastes, the 12th chapter, and they already did here, verse 13. Actually, let's see. Yeah, the conclusion, when all has been heard, is fear God and keep His commandments, because this applies to every person. For God will bring every act to judgment, everything which is hidden, whether good or evil. So most people remember that phrase, usually different wording in the King James Version, that that all of man is to fear God and keep His commandments. So, one thing I think we need to remember, and the reason this outline is broken up this way, that is not the first time that conclusion is reached. And so each one of these, we have this conclusion break that we've chosen to break at, that says, basically we look to God, that we are trying to do something that we look toward God. So in chapter 2 and verse 24 through 26 there is the first conclusion. And we can see in verse 24 as it starts out, there is nothing better for a man than. So we see wording like that, it breaks down into a conclusion, and then we start another discourse. I think the discourses, there are 4 of them, but they all are trying to lead us down a path and then present that lesson a slightly different way, and then get more detailed as they move. So many of us learn in different ways. Many of us see different concepts, and then we may spur thought based upon something that was said. We see Solomon moving us through this whole book as it begins with kind of all fulfillment comes from God, and then man must trust God and realize His promise and fulfillment. 3 kind of discusses some of the answers to the iniquities of life, and then the inequalities of life, and then in the end, really not a lot of new information is presented, but kind of re-explains a lot of the other discouragements and conclusions that we have discussed, and then concludes ultimately that God is where we must turn. Now, I've heard this before. I didn't do a lot of study on this, but a lot of folks have thought that if Solomon is the author of this, that could mean that near the end of his life he actually realized his folly and turned back. I certainly hope that's the case, but we have no other evidence than this book and his conclusions that he realizes that's at least what he needed to do. Just don't know what he did, and I think it's a lesson to us, especially one that I've expressed to the high school class where I've taught this before, is that we have to be concerned about the fact that there are things that we do in this life that have consequences. Right? And Solomon has done so many things with his life, even though we're not told everything about it. But he's done so many different things within his life, and he may be at a point where he has to live with all those consequences, so he can't see his own children and the way they change. But we certainly see one of his sons and his attitude, and it doesn't seem like the whole concept of God and what he should do and how he should approach things ever got through. So certainly we need to be considerate of the fact that our life is a work. We've walked that life, and yet the things that we may do that are wrong certainly has consequences along the way. Kind of overarching theme. So overall, there's a struggle. Kind of ties back to the theme. There's this whole struggle of this good versus bad. Kind of the bad first is that we read some of these verses, and it talks about this really harsh reality of our life, right? Of our life here on this earth. Sometimes we have difficulty. Sometimes things are unfair. Things are unjust. Does that happen today? We see it certainly recorded here in the times of Solomon. Does any of that happen today? Is any of this relevant to us? Yeah. So, when I was thinking about this last night, I thought about the fact that there are there are certain things that I used to do that I just don't do anymore. And unfortunately, one of them is watch the news or follow politics. Because what that does to me is make me realize all the things that I don't have any control over. We're all supposed to have the word in politics here. We vote these people in. They're supposed to do the things that each of us individually, even though there's hundreds, thousands of people that vote for these people, like we all have the same mind, right? And they're going to always do the right thing, and that vote's always going to be just the way we want it. Now, that doesn't happen. So there's difficulty, there's unfairness, there's injustice, there's things that we want to happen that does not happen, right? But here specifically, this begins to provide some answers, and we see things like God fills a void as man seeks to fill something, this blank space, right, that's within us. God can fill that void, and that the fear of God provides that eternal answer. So we shape all of those things. Life can be difficult, but we're provided with this answer, and if we fear Him, then we have eternal hope. If we look at James, the 4th chapter, and verse 14, real quick. I have that in my notes. Yet you do not know what your life will be like tomorrow. You're just a vapor that appears for a little while and then vanishes away. We have to remember those words, especially as we go through the book of Ecclesiastes, because we see that, and we see that concept as being vanity. Also, one thing that I didn't mention last week when I was talking about Proverbs, and then we spoke of wisdom, is that in James, the 1st chapter, what are we told that we can do if we seek wisdom? Remember that? That if you seek wisdom, then you can pray to God for it. In James, the 1st chapter, verse 4 or something. In verse 5. But if any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask God, who gives to all generously and without reproach, and it will be given to him. I think this is something that we need to pray for. Right? We should pray for wisdom. We should pray for knowledge. And we should try to develop that understanding so that we can use all those things appropriately. So, all right. So now, let's begin with Ecclesiastes chapter 1, and we'll start in verse 2. It says, vanity of vanities, says the preacher, vanity of vanities, all is vanity. What advantage does a man have in all his work, which he does under the sun? A generation goes and a generation comes, but the earth remains forever. Also, the sun rises and the sun sets, and hastening to its place, it rises there again. Blowing toward the south, then turning toward the north, the wind continues swirling along, and on its circular courses the wind returns. All the rivers flow into the sea, yet the sea is not full. To the place where the rivers flow, there they flow again. All things are wearisome. Man is not able to tell it. The eye is not satisfied with the seeing, nor is the ear filled with hearing. That which has been is that which will be, and that which has been done is that which will be done. Is there anything new under the sun? So what are these first 9 verses really telling us? There's some pictures up here. The sun rises and it sets. How often does that happen? Every day. Rivers flow down into the sea or into the ocean. But what happens to the water level? Nothing. We see patterns of, I tried to get the globe with some kind of a cloud pattern there, right? We see the patterns of our weather, right? We see wind that comes. Where did it come from? Don't know, but it's not always like that. But what happens? We have the cycle. It's always there. So, was it there when our great grandparents were here? Was it there when our great? Has it always been there? This man's been on this earth. Right. That's right. Paul said that God set the bounds of our habitation. But when you look at this and you see, what is the point that Solomon's trying to make here? Yep. All right. The scientific community has taken years and years to actually get to the point where they can explain some of the things that Solomon talks about here as general truths, right? Because they've always been general truths. And yet, it kind of goes to a much deeper theme that goes throughout here that, men continues to seek and they continue to look and they continue to find more. And we'll see, hopefully we'll get to that in here in a minute. But we'll see today that wisdom just gets you almost more depressed, right? The more knowledge gets you even just more sorrow, because now there's actually more that you figure out that you don't know. Right? You thought that you didn't understand the general concept, and now you realize that not only do I think I got this, but that's made up of 3 or 4 more pillars, and I don't know anything about any of those. And so it's a very good point that our science is somewhat behind the time when it comes to the Ecclesiastes. Right? So, how are Solomon's observations that there's nothing new under the sun? How does that relate to this theme of the book? Right? That we see. Well, let me say this. We see advances in technology today, right? We see nuclear power, we see cell phones, we see aircraft, we see all that stuff. But in the end, what's man's state? We have air conditioning now, so that means that we may live a little cooler in the summer. We have heaters outside, so that means that we may live a little warmer in the winter. But what happens in the end? Did we stop dying? Did the cycle stop? No. So, that's right. It's a good point. I don't know if everybody can hear Randall, but he said it's like sitting down with 100-year-old godly man who really can boil it down and ask the question about what did he do with his life, not what did he acquire or what does he have. It's more about the longer term thought of what did I actually do with my life and what is my end result of that. So then we see in verse 10 and 11, it says, is there anything of which one might say, see, this is new. Already it has existed for ages which were before us. There's no remembrance of earlier things, and also of the latter things which occur. There will be for them no remembrance among those who will come later still. So we see that we see that all these things are not new under the sun. There's this cycle, but then in verse 12 we start from thought. I, the preacher, having been king over Israel and Jerusalem, and I set my mind to seek and explore by wisdom concerning all that has been done under the sun. It is a grievous task which God has given to the sons of men to be afflicted with. I have seen all the works which have been done under the sun, and behold, all is vanity and striving after the wind. What is crooked cannot be straightened, and what is lacking cannot be counted. I said to myself, behold, I have magnified and increased wisdom more than all who were over Jerusalem before me, and my mind has observed a wealth of wisdom and knowledge. And I set my mind to know wisdom and to know madness and folly. I realized that this is also striving after the wind, because in much wisdom there is much grief, and increasing knowledge results in increasing pain. That's what I talked about just a few seconds ago, right? That it seems like the more knowledge you have, the more wisdom you have, is the more grief that you see. And so, why is man unsatisfied? Why does he seek additional fulfillment? I think it's because, as we see here in 13 through 18, we see all these works that have been done, and yet it says the crooked cannot be straightened, and what is lacking cannot be counted. Right? What happens, or do we ever experience the righteous suffering and those who are unrighteous succeed? If we're going to use man's wisdom and we're going to look around here, we're going to start to try to equate certain things that people do with the outcome of that they have. Yet, that doesn't make sense to us in the long run. And so this crooked can't be straightened, and then what's lacking can't be counted. So let's move on to chapter 2, or else I'll never get done. Any other comments about that? I think chapter 2 is, especially the beginning of it is here, very, very important. I said to myself, come now, I will test you with pleasure, so enjoy yourself, and behold, it too was futility. I said of laughter, is it madness, and of pleasure? What does it accomplish? I explored with my mind how to stimulate my body with wine while my mind was guiding me wisely, and how to take hold of folly until I could see what good there was for the sons of men to do under the heavens the few years of their life. I enlarged my works, I built my houses for myself, I planted vineyards for myself, I made gardens and parks for myself, I planted them in all kinds of fruit trees, I made ponds of water for myself from which to irrigate a forest of growing trees. I bought male and female servants, I had homeborn slaves, I possessed flocks and herds larger than all who preceded me in Jerusalem. Also I collected for myself silver and gold and the treasure of kings and provinces. I provided for myself male and female singers and the pleasures of men, many concubines. Then I became great and increased more than all who preceded me in Jerusalem. My wisdom also stood by me. All that my eyes desired, I did not refuse them. I did not withhold my heart from any pleasure, for my heart was pleased because of all my labor. And this was my reward for all my labor. Thus I considered all my activities which my hands had done, and the labor which I had exerted, and behold, all was vanity and striving after the wind. There was no profit under the sun. So what had Solomon done? What had Solomon done with all that he had? Right. First of all, I think you see that as he is described in 1 Kings, and the amount that he had everything. He had wealth, he had wisdom. We see the story where Sheba comes and visits him and is in awe of all that he has. Right? He built things. He had fruit trees and orchards and people, and they waited on him hand and foot. It says that he even tried to do things that were, foolish, just to see if that worked, and that could get him. But in the end, he found that it came to nothing. And so what we see in verse 10, he did all that his eyes desired. He did not withhold anything from them. I think that kind of points to, what do children say? So what do kids say today? What do even adults say today? Whenever they think they have a different way. Right? Oh, well, you didn't do this, and you don't understand how this would work, so this is going to be way, way better. Yet, here's Solomon, who was looking for the core condition piece, right? It's not about the cell phone or the new home or the new car. Right? It's not about that. He's looking for changes that would make man seek something that is far beyond what his current condition is. He says, everything I did, I could do anything I wanted, and I did anything I wanted. And what was the answer? That's right. Luke 12. Luke chapter 12, verses 13 through 21, where we see Jesus, and he's talking to us about the rich man who did exactly that, right? Who went and said, oh, I've got all this great wealth, I've got all this great crop, so what am I going to do? I'm going to tear down my barns, and what happens the very next day? His life was required. You never know when that's going to occur. You think that you could collect these things, you think these things are going to satisfy you and make you better, but then what happens in the end when that is taken away from you? So, one of the questions is why specifically is it important that we see that Solomon exhausted all of his avenues? And it goes back to kind of what I was saying a while ago, which is if he exhausted all of his avenues, why do you think that some of the things that we have, which would just be a portion of that, is going to be able to find something that is much better? So, verse 12, so I turned to consider wisdom, madness, and folly. For what will the man do who will come after the king except what has already been done? And I saw that wisdom excels folly, and his light excels darkness. The wise man's eyes are in his head, but the fool walks in darkness. And yet I know that one fate befalls them both. Then I said to myself, as the fate of the fool, it will also befall me. Why then have I been extremely wise? So I said to myself, this too is vain. For there is no lasting remembrance of the wise man as with the fool. Inasmuch as the coming days all will be forgotten, and how the wise man and the fool alike die. So, what happens is the wise man has a better view, a better understanding of what is occurring, but what happens in the end between the wise man and the fool? The same thing. So if we keep everything here on this level as physical as on this earth, what do we see? That we all reach the same fate, and it's all vanity, as he says, right? In verse 18 it starts, thus I hated all the fruit of my labor, which I had labored under the sun, for I must leave it to the man who will come after me, and who knows whether he will be a wise man or a fool. Yet he will have control over all the fruits of my labor, which I have labored. Which I have labored by acting wisely under the sun. This too is vanity. Therefore I completely despaired all the fruit of my labor, for which I had labored under the sun. When there is a man who has labored with wisdom, knowledge, and skill, then he gives his legacy to the one who has not labored with him. This too is vanity and great evil. For what does a man get in all his labor and in his strivings with which he labors under the sun? Because all his days his task is painful and grievous, even at night. His mind does not rest. This too is done. So now we see, and we made this comment, I think, earlier, several classes ago, but you have a man who has gathered and created much wealth for himself, but then what happens at the end? Can he take it with him? And we see Solomon sitting here going, that doesn't seem right. I'm going to have used my wisdom to create this, and then when I'm gone, who does it go to? Someone who hasn't worked for it at all. Right? And that someone may be wise or may be foolish. We see that today. Very, very wealthy that leaves a lot of money to their own children, and then when it occurs, some are very successful and continue on, others are not. So those are all things that he sees no profit. You also see the concept where this man who has a lot, he's not. It's not always enough, right? Those who have different problems, right? They worry about what they have and how they can keep what they have, right? So the other thought here that this man could lose it too. Right? That man could lose his wealth, and then he's almost worse than the one who never had it. So we conclude this section and this first discourse in verse 24, saying there's nothing better for a man than to eat and drink and tell himself that his labor is good. This also I have seen, that is from the hand of God. So really the first time we see this concept of this is what God has meant for man, right? The conclusion here is that man will eat and drink and be happy in the labor that he has, right? For who can eat and who can have enjoyment without him, without God? That's right. I forgot. I blew up past my slides, but that's correct. We're not all going to be a Solomon, and we can't move on without God. So there was a comment, I think, and I was listening to Trevor talk about this section whenever he taught this several years ago here, but he kind of referred back to a statement, and it was a statement that Paul made in Romans 9th chapter, and it's referring to the fact that what Solomon's trying to do here in Ecclesiastes and what Paul was trying to do to the Romans, and that is that anticipating this next argument, right? It's, in Romans 9:19 it says, "You will say to me this," and then he begins to discuss why that answer is what it is. So I think we see this whole point as Solomon goes through this first discourse. What he also does in the second discourse and the third and the fourth is trying to lay out the details and then come back and shore them up as to why it is the way it is. Let's quickly read part of chapter 3, and then this will give Tracy plenty of things to discuss on Wednesday, because I know he always has trouble trying to fit stuff into his time. There's an appointed time for everything, and there's time for every event under heaven. A time to give birth, a time to die, a time to plant, a time to uproot what is planted, a time to kill, heal, tear down, to build up, to weep, to laugh, to mourn, to dance, to throw stones, to gather stones, to embrace, to shun embracing, search, time to give up that which is lost, a time to keep, and a time to throw away, to tear apart and sew together, to be silent and to speak, to love and to hate, for war and for peace. Verse 9, what profit is there to the worker from that which he toils? I have seen the task which God has given the sons of men, which is to occupy themselves. So once again, as we saw this concept in the beginning of chapter 1, we see it here again in 3. Right? God has set things in motion. There are times that things are going to happen, and God has set aside all these times. And unfortunately, there are things that we talk about, in this area, that we would say maybe evil, but the evil from the concept of what we had defined earlier. Right? There's good and there's bad, and we have to deal with all of those pieces because that's the way things are working. And so we'll conclude the second discourse and move on Wednesday night. Thanks for your comments and your attention.